The quiet ranch hand had one rule: don't touch the saddlebag. Inside was the photograph that ended 3 families. The morning sun hung like a brass coin over the Morrison ranch when the stranger rode in, his horse moving with the careful steps of something that had traveled far and seen too much. Dust lifted from the hoofbeats and settled again, as if the earth itself was tired of movement. Sarah Morrison stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She watched the rider approach with the stillness of someone who had learned to read danger in the way a man sat his saddle. This one rode straight-backed, but loose, like he was carrying something heavy that couldn't be set down. The horse was a good one, a bay mare with intelligent eyes and legs that spoke of careful breeding. But it was the man who held Sarah's attention. He wore the sun-faded clothes of someone who worked with his hands, and his hat was pulled low enough to hide most of his face. What she could see was weathered skin and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I'm looking for work. Heard in town that Morrison might need a hand." His voice carried the dust of long silences, rough from disuse but steady. Sarah noticed how his right hand rested on his thigh, close to the gun that rode his hip but not touching it. A careful man. A man who had learned to be ready for trouble without looking like he was expecting it. "Pa's in the barn," she said, studying his face in the shadow of his hat brim. "I can fetch him if you want to wait." The stranger nodded and dismounted with the fluid motion of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. As his boots touched the earth, Sarah caught sight of his saddlebag. Old leather, worn smooth in places, buckled tight, and positioned where his hand could find it without looking. Most men carried their provisions loose, easy to get at. This bag was different. This bag had secrets. "I'll wait," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that made Sarah think of winter mornings when the silence stretched so long you forgot what your own voice sounded like. She went to find her father, but not before taking another look at the stranger. He stood beside his horse, one hand resting on the mare's neck, his eyes scanning the ranch buildings with the quick efficiency of someone who had learned to map escape routes out of habit. The saddlebag hung at his side like a weight, and Sarah found herself wondering what a man might carry that would make him guard it like gospel and gunpowder both. Tom Morrison emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on an old rag. His weathered face creased with the lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises. He was a good judge of horses and a better judge of men, and Sarah watched him take the stranger's measure with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating stock. "Name's Morrison," her father said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of honest work. The stranger took it with a grip that was firm but brief. "Cole," he said. Just that. No last name, no explanation. Sarah noticed her father didn't press for more. In this country, a man's past was his own business until it became someone else's problem. "Can you work cattle?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir." "Handle a horse without breaking its spirit?" "Yes, sir." "Keep your mouth shut and your hands busy." For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of the stranger's mouth. "That I can do." Morrison nodded. "Pays 20 a month and found. Bunkhouse is clean and the grub's fair. You'll work with the stock mostly, some fence repair when it's needed." "Can you start now?" "Yes, sir." The negotiation was over as quick as that, with the economy of words that marked men who had learned to judge character in the space between question and answer. But Sarah noticed how the stranger's hand never moved far from that saddlebag, and how his eyes kept tracking movement even while he spoke with her father. As Morrison showed Cole toward the bunkhouse, Sarah remained on the porch, watching the way the man walked. There was something wounded in his gait, not in his body, but in his spirit. She had seen it before in men who came through, men who carried the weight of things they couldn't set down and couldn't carry much longer. The saddlebag swayed with each step, and Sarah found herself thinking about the stories her grandmother used to tell about men who carried their ghosts in leather pouches, bound tight against the world, but never quite secure enough to keep the past from seeping out like blood through bandages. Cole settled into the rhythm of ranch work with the ease of someone who understood that labor was sometimes the only prayer a man had left. He rose before dawn and worked until the sun painted the mountains purple, moving through his tasks with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that staying busy was the only way to keep certain thoughts at bay. He was good with the horses, Sarah noticed. Better than good. They trusted him in a way that spoke of old understanding, as she often found herself watching from the kitchen window as he worked with the difficult ones, his voice low and steady as summer rain. But it was the careful way he handled his possessions that kept drawing her attention. Each evening, he would take that saddlebag into the bunkhouse with him, and each morning it would emerge unchanged, its secrets still locked behind worn leather and tarnished buckles. Sarah had always been curious by nature, a trait her mother had warned would lead her into trouble. But there was something about Cole's careful silence that made her want to understand what kind of burden could make a man's shoulders bow even when he stood straight. 3 days passed in the rhythm of ordinary work, but Sarah could feel the weight of unspoken things settling over the ranch like dust before a storm. Cole spoke only when spoken to, ate his meals in silence, and spent his evenings on the bunkhouse porch, staring at horizons that seemed to hold more ghosts than sky. On the 4th morning, Sarah brought him coffee while he worked with a fractious colt in the corral. He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, and for a moment their eyes met. What she saw there made her breath catch, pain so deep and carefully hidden that she felt like she was looking at a man drowning in still water. "Sometimes talking helps," she said quietly. Cole's hand tightened on the coffee cup, and his gaze moved to the saddlebag he had hung on the corral post. For a heartbeat, Sarah thought he might speak, might let some small piece of his burden into the light. Instead, he finished his coffee and handed her back the cup. "Some things are better left buried, miss." But Sarah Morrison had never been one to leave well enough alone, and as she walked back toward the house, she wondered what kind of ghosts a man might carry in a saddlebag, and whether the weight of them might eventually break even the strongest back. The morning sun climbed higher, casting short shadows that would grow long again before the day was done. And somewhere in the careful distance Cole maintained from the world, something dangerous was beginning to stir. The weeks settled into a rhythm as steady as heartbeats, with Cole moving through his work like a man walking through a dream he couldn't wake from. Sarah watched him from corners and doorways, the way she might watch a wild horse, careful not to spook him, but unable to look away. He had a gift with the animals that went beyond skill. The horses gentled under his hands like they understood something about him that humans couldn't see. Even Thunder, her father's black stallion that had never let another soul ride him, would stand quiet when Cole approached, ears forward and eyes soft. "He's got the touch," her father said one evening as they watched Cole work with a mare that had been fighting the bit for weeks. Under his patient hands, she settled into the harness like she'd been born to it. Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about the way Cole's shoulders carried their invisible weight, and how his eyes always seemed to be looking at something just beyond the horizon. The horses felt it too, that careful distance he kept from the world, like he was afraid that getting too close might bring harm to whatever he touched. It was on a Thursday morning, with the sun barely clearing the mountains, that Sarah found Cole in the stable talking to the horses. Not the way most men talk to animals, with commands and rough affection, but the way someone might speak to old friends who had been through hard times together. "Morning finds us all eventually," he was saying to Thunder, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "Some mornings are harder than others, but they keep coming whether we're ready or not." The stallion nickered softly, and Cole's hand moved along the horse's neck with the gentleness of someone who understood that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and slow to mend. Sarah stepped into the stable, and Cole's head turned toward her with the quick awareness of someone who had learned to track movement without seeming to. His hand stilled on Thunder's neck, and she saw him pull back into himself like a turtle drawing into its shell. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "I brought coffee." She held out the cup, steam rising from it like morning mist. Cole accepted it with a nod, but she noticed how he positioned himself so that the saddlebag hanging on the stall post was always in his line of sight. "They listen to you," Sarah said, gesturing toward the horses. "Most men think animals can't understand words, but you talk to them like they do." Cole sipped his coffee and studied her over the rim of the cup. In the dim light of the stable, his eyes looked older than his years, like they had seen things that aged a man from the inside out. Animals hear more than words, he said finally. They hear what's underneath. Can't lie to a horse the way you can to people. What do they hear when you talk to them? The question hung in the air between them like dust motes in a sunbeam. Cole's grip tightened on the coffee cup, and for a moment Sarah thought she had pushed too far, asked too much of a man who gave away pieces of himself as carefully as a miser counted coins. They hear someone who understands what it means to be careful of the world, he said. There was something in those words that made Sarah's chest tighten. She had always been good at reading people, a skill learned from years of helping her father judge the character of men who came looking for work or shelter. But Cole was like trying to read writing that had been worn away by too much weather. You could see that something important had been there, but the details were lost to time and elements. The days that followed brought them into an easy partnership born of shared work and comfortable silences. Sarah would bring him coffee in the mornings, and they would stand together watching the horses, speaking little but understanding much. She learned that he had come from somewhere east, that he knew about cattle and horses and the 100 small skills that kept a ranch running, and that whatever had brought him to their door weighed on him like stones in his pockets. But it was the way he guarded that saddlebag that told her the most. He never left it unattended, never let it out of his sight for more than a few minutes. When he worked in the corrals, it hung on a post where he could see it. When he ate his meals, it sat beside his chair. At night, it went with him into the bunkhouse like a faithful dog. Sarah had seen men carry their worldly possessions with care: money, letters from home, photographs of sweethearts left behind. But this was different. This was a man carrying something that might destroy him if he set it down, and might destroy him if he kept carrying it. The fever came on a Tuesday night in October, swift and merciless as winter wind. Tom Morrison had been feeling poorly for days, complaining of aches and a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. By midnight, he was burning with heat and shaking with chills, his body fighting a battle it was already losing. Sarah sat beside his bed through the long hours before dawn, cooling his forehead with damp cloths and listening to his labored breathing. When the sun rose, she knew she needed help, and there was only one person close enough to matter. She found Cole in the stable, already at work despite the early hour. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad. I need a ride to town for the doctor, but I can't leave him alone." "Not like this." Cole nodded without hesitation. "I'll stay with him. You ride hard and don't worry about anything here." The doctor was 3 hours away by hard riding, and when Sarah returned with him in the late afternoon, she found Cole sitting beside her father's bed with the patience of someone who had kept vigil before. The saddlebag sat on the floor beside his chair, close enough to touch, but temporarily forgotten in the face of more immediate need. Dr. Patterson examined Tom Morrison with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too many fevers take too many good people. When he emerged from the bedroom, his face carried the weight of unwelcome news. "It's pneumonia," he said. "Bad pneumonia. He's a strong man, but he's not young anymore." The next few days will tell the tale. Those days stretched like years, filled with the rhythm of sickness and the careful dance of keeping someone alive through pure stubborn will. Cole proved to be a steady presence, spelling Sarah when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, helping her lift her father when the fever made him restless, and maintaining the endless routine of cool cloths and spoonfuls of broth. It was during one of those long nights, with her father's breathing finally settling into something that resembled peaceful sleep, that Sarah noticed Cole staring at his saddlebag with an expression she had never seen before, something that might have been longing or regret, or the look of a man remembering something he wished he could forget. "What's in there?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Cole's head turned toward her, and in the lamplight she saw his face stripped of its careful defenses. For a moment, he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump or turn back. "Something that should have been buried a long time ago," he said. "But you keep it. Some things won't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole." Sarah looked at her father's sleeping form, at the rise and fall of his chest that meant he was still fighting, still holding on. She thought about the weight that Cole carried, and how some burdens grew heavier with time instead of lighter. Maybe the weight of carrying it is worse than the weight of letting it go, she said. Cole's hand moved toward the saddlebag, then stopped. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah saw the man he might have been before whatever was in that bag had claimed him, and she understood that some people spent their whole lives carrying ghosts they couldn't release and couldn't forget. When morning came, her father's fever had broken, and Cole was gone from the chair beside the bed. She found him on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, the saddlebag at his feet like a faithful shadow that followed him wherever he went. The riders came with the November wind, 3 men moving across the landscape like shadows given flesh and purpose. Sarah saw them first from the kitchen window, black shapes against the gray morning sky, still distant but coming steady as death itself. Her father was mending in the parlor, his strength returning slowly but surely, like water filling a well drop by drop. Cole was in the barn tending to a lame horse, his movements careful and sure as always, but there was something different about him this morning, a tension that seemed to coil tighter with each passing hour, as if he was waiting for something he had always known would come. "Pa," Sarah called, keeping her voice level despite the cold finger of dread that traced her spine. "We got company coming." Tom Morrison rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man still recovering from fever's grip. He joined her at the window, his weathered hands gripping the sill as he studied the approaching riders. "Don't like the look of them," he said after a long moment. "Men riding that purposeful don't usually bring good news." Sarah nodded, her eyes tracking the riders as they drew closer. There was something predatory in the way they moved, like wolves following a scent. Her gaze drifted toward the barn where Cole worked, and a terrible understanding began to bloom in her chest like a dark flower. "I'll get the rifle," her father said, but Sarah was already moving toward the door. "I'll warn Cole," she said, and stepped into the morning air that suddenly felt sharp as broken glass. The barn was dim and warm after the bite of November wind, filled with the comfortable sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the rustle of hay. She found Cole kneeling beside the lame mare, his hands gentle on her injured leg, but his face was turned toward the barn door like he was listening for something only he could hear. "Cole," she said quietly, and he looked up at her with eyes that held no surprise, only a weary acceptance that made her heart clench. "How many?" he asked. "3, maybe 4 miles out." He stood slowly, brushing hay from his knees, and walked to where his saddlebag hung on a post. For the first time since she had known him, his hand trembled as he reached for the worn leather. "Sarah," he said without turning around, "you need to stay in the house. Keep your father inside, and don't come out no matter what you hear." "Who are they, Cole?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and the dust of too many miles. "Men who think they know the truth about something that happened a long time ago." "And do they?" Cole's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "They know part of it. The part that looks like guilt in a courtroom and pays money in a bank. But they don't know the whole truth, and the whole truth is what's been eating me alive all these years." Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the way his shoulders carried their burden, close enough to smell the leather and dust and something else, the scent of a man who had been running from something that ran faster than horses could carry him. "Show me," she said. "Sarah, show me what's in the bag, Cole. If you're going to die for it, I deserve to know what it is." His hands stilled on the saddlebag's buckles, and she saw him fighting with himself, weighing the cost of secrets against the price of truth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn door and carrying with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Cole's fingers worked the buckles with the reverence of someone handling something sacred or cursed, perhaps both. The leather bag opened with a soft sigh, and from within he drew a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling, its surface creased from years of careful folding and unfolding. He held out to her with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. Sarah took the photograph and felt the weight of it, heavier than paper had any right to be. In the dim light of the barn, she could make out the images. 3 families posed together in front of church, men and women and children dressed in their Sunday best, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of people who believed the world was a safe place. The Hendersons, the Coopers, and the Martins, Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good people. God-fearing people. They hire me to guide them through the mountains to Oregon Territory. Promised them I'd get them there safe. Sarah studied the faces in the photograph. Young couples with hope in their eyes. Children who would never grow up to chase their own dreams. Old folks who deserved to see their grandchildren born. Her throat tightened as understanding crept over her like cold water. What happened to them? Ambush in Devil's Canyon. 20 men, maybe more, waiting in the rocks like spiders in a web. I was scouting ahead, checking the trail, when I heard the shooting start. Cole's voice broke like a dry branch. By the time I got back, it was over. All of them. Even the children. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph. The bounty hunters think I led them into it on purpose. Think I was working with the gang that killed them. There was a survivor, one of the bandits, and before he died in jail, he claimed he knew me, claimed I was in on the whole thing. Said I got paid to deliver those families to their deaths. The barn door creaked in the wind, and both of them turned toward the sound. The hoofbeats were closer now, close enough to count. 3 horses moving at a steady pace that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going. But you weren't, Sarah said, and it wasn't a question. Cole's eyes met hers, and she saw in them the pain of a man who had been carrying the weight of other people's deaths for years, who had been judged and found guilty by a world that didn't want to hear his side of the story. I failed them, he said. I was supposed to keep them safe, and I failed. But I didn't betray them. I'd have died before I let harm come to those children. Sarah looked again at the photograph, at the faces of people who had trusted a young man to guide them to a new life and had found death instead. She understood now why Cole carried this image with him, why he guarded it like a treasure and a curse combined. It was proof of his failure, but it was also the only thing left of the people he had tried to save. Why didn't you just throw it away? She asked. Because someone should remember them. Someone should carry the weight of what happened, even if it crushes them. They deserved better than to just disappear like they never existed. The sound of horses stopped outside the barn, and Sarah heard the creak of leather as men dismounted. Voices carried on the wind, hard voices that spoke of business rather than social calls. Cole took the photograph from her hands and folded it carefully before placing it back in the saddlebag. His movements were gentle, reverent, like he was putting away something holy. I won't let them hurt you or your father, he said. But I can't run anymore. Sarah, I'm tired of running. She caught his arm as he started toward the barn door. There has to be another way. We can explain. Men like that don't listen to explanations. They see a bounty and a wanted poster, and that's all the truth they need. Cole's hand covered hers where it gripped his arm. You've been kind to me, kinder than I deserved. But this is my burden to carry, not yours. Through the gaps in the barn siding, Sarah could see the 3 riders now, hard-faced men with guns on their hips, and a look of people who had never met a problem they couldn't solve with violence. One of them was studying the house, while the other 2 examined the ground around the barn, reading tracts like other men read newspapers. Cole Thompson, one of them called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. We know you're here. Come out peaceful, and nobody else needs to get hurt. Cole's hand moved to his gun, and Sarah saw him transform from the gentleman who talked to horses into something harder, more dangerous. But she also saw the resignation in his eyes, the look of someone who had been expecting this moment for years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Stay back, he told her. Whatever happens, stay back and don't try to help. Promise me. Sarah wanted a promise, wanted to give him the words that would ease the worry in his eyes. But as she looked at the photograph's impression still visible in the worn leather of the saddlebag, at the faces of families who had trusted the wrong people at the wrong time, she realized that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to fight for the living. The barn door swung open on hinges that screamed like morning wind, and Cole stepped into the pale November light with his burden finally ready to be shared, one way or another. The November morning held its breath as Cole stepped into the yard, his shadow long and dark against the frost-touched ground. The three bounty hunters spread out like wolves preparing to close on wounded prey, their hands resting easy on their guns with the confidence of men who had done this dance many times before. Sarah pressed herself against the barn door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the gap in the wood, she could see her father standing on the porch with his rifle, his face grim but determined. The fever had weakened his body, but it had done nothing to diminish the steel in his spine. Cole Thompson, the leader of the bounty hunters, called out. He was a lean man with gray eyes and a mouth that looked like it had been carved from stone. You've led us a long chase, but it ends here. Cole stood 20 feet from the barn, his hands loose at his sides, the saddlebag still slung across his shoulder like the weight of the world made leather. It's got a name, he said quietly. Captain Marcus Reed. And you're wrong about what happened in Devil's Canyon. Reed's laugh was dry as desert wind. Dead men don't lie, Thompson. Jimmy Vargas told us all about how you sold those families to Bronson's gang. How you got paid blood money for leading them into that ambush. Jimmy Vargas was dying when he said that. Men say all kinds of things when they're trying to buy themselves a few more minutes of breathing. Maybe so, but the territorial judge believes him, and that's enough for us. Reed's hand moved closer to his gun. You can come with us peaceful, or we can drag your body back to Cheyenne. Makes no difference to the money we're collecting. Sarah saw Cole's shoulders settle, saw him find that place of stillness that came before action. She had watched him work with fractious horses, had seen him gentle the wildest animals with patience and understanding. But this was different. This was a man preparing to fight for something more precious than his own life. I won't go back to hang for something I didn't do, Cole said. Then you'll die here, Reed replied, and his hand dropped toward his gun. What happened next unfolded with the terrible beauty of lightning striking, too fast to fully comprehend, too important to look away from. Cole's hand moved like striking thunder, his Colt clearing leather with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to survive by being faster than death itself. The first shot echoed across the ranch like Judgment Day, and one of Reed's men spun and fell, his gun unfired in his hand. The second bounty hunter got his weapon clear, but never had the chance to aim. Cole's second bullet took him in the chest and dropped him like a stone. Reed was faster than his companions, his gun coming up smooth and sure, but Cole was already moving, rolling behind the water trough as Reed's bullet whined through the space where he had been standing. "Give it up, Thompson!" Reed shouted, his voice tight with the first taste of fear. "You can't run forever." Cole's voice came from behind the trough, steady as bedrock. "I'm not running anymore." The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the wind moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood tree beside the house. Sarah could see Reed crouched behind his dead horse, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement, his gun ready to speak death. It was then that Sarah made her choice, not with her mind, but with something deeper, something that understood the difference between justice and vengeance, between truth and the stories people told themselves to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. She stepped out of the barn, her hands empty, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Captain Reed." Both men froze, their attention snapping to her like compass needles finding north. Reed's gun swung toward her, and she saw Cole rise from behind the trough, his face twisted with desperate fear. Not for himself, but for her. "Sarah, get back!" Cole shouted, but she was already walking forward, her steps deliberate and sure. "Captain Reed," she said again, her voice calm as summer rain. "I know the truth about Devil's Canyon." Reed's gun wavered, confusion replacing certainty in his gray eyes. "Lady, you weren't there. You don't know nothing about it." "No, but I know Cole Thompson. I've watched him for weeks, seen how he treats animals, how he talks to them like they're people worth saving. I've seen him sit beside a sick man's bed all night, asking nothing in return. I've seen him carry the weight of other people's deaths like it was his own cross to bear." She was close enough now to see the sweat on Reed's face. close enough to smell the gun smoke and the fear that always accompanied men when they realized they might be wrong about something that couldn't be undone. A man who would betray families for money doesn't carry their photograph with him everywhere he goes, Sarah continued. He doesn't guard their memory like it was more precious than his own life. He doesn't talk to horses about morning coming whether we're ready or not, because he's been living in the darkness of guilt for years. Cole's voice was rough with emotion. Sarah, don't. He's been carrying their ghosts because he thinks someone should, she said, her eyes never leaving Reed's face. Because he thinks someone should remember that the Hendersons and the Coopers and the Martins were good people who deserved better than to die in some nameless canyon, forgotten by everyone except the man who tried to save them. Reed's gun lowered slightly, uncertainty creeping across his features like shadows at sunset. Vargas swore. Vargas was a dying man looking for someone to blame besides himself, Sarah said. But Cole Thompson has been living with the blame every day since it happened, carrying it like stones in his pockets, even though the only thing he's guilty of is failing to be in two places at once. The morning wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet and carrying with it the scent of change. Not the violent change that came with guns and blood, but the quieter transformation that happened when truth finally found its voice. Cole stepped out from behind the trough, his gun still in his hand but pointed at the ground. His face was a map of years spent running from something that had never been chasing him. Only his own conscience, demanding payment for sins he had never committed. She's right, he said quietly. I've been carrying their deaths like they were my fault, but the only thing I'm guilty of is not being good enough to save them all. Reed looked between them, his weathered face showing the first cracks in his certainty. Sarah could see him weighing the evidence, the money against the truth, the easy answer against the complicated one. The bounty's still good, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Blood money always is, Sarah replied. But that doesn't make it right. For a long moment, the three of them stood in the yard like figures in a photograph, frozen between past and future, between vengeance and mercy. Then Reed slowly holstered his gun, his movements heavy with the weight of a decision that would haunt him either way. I can't take back what I came here to do, he said, but I can choose not to do it. He looked at Cole with something that might have been respect, or regret, or simply the recognition of one man's burden by another who carried his own. You keep running, Thompson. Keep running and don't look back, because the next bounty hunters might not stop to listen. Reed mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, leaving behind the bodies of his companions and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Sarah watched him disappear into the distance, then turned to find Cole staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. Why? He asked. Sarah looked at the saddlebag still slung across his shoulder, at the careful way he carried the memory of people who had died too soon and too far from home. She thought about the photograph inside, about the faces of families who had trusted the wrong world but the right man. Because everyone deserves someone to speak for them when they can't speak for themselves, she said. And because carrying the dead doesn't have to mean burying the living. Cole's hand moved to the saddlebag, his fingers tracing the worn leather with something that looked like wonder. For the first time since she had known him, his shoulders didn't carry the weight of the world. I don't know how to stop carrying them, he said. Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent looking backward instead of forward. Maybe you don't stop carrying them. Maybe you just learn to carry them different, not like a burden, but like a blessing. Not like guilt, but like love. The November sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and warming the earth beneath their feet. Somewhere in the distance, horses nickered in their pasture, and the ordinary sounds of ranch life began to reassert themselves over the echoes of gunfire and hard choices. Cole reached into his saddlebag one last time and drew out the photograph. But instead of folding it away like a secret, he held it up to the light, letting Sarah see the faces of the people who had become his ghosts. The Hendersons wanted to raise apples, he said, his voice soft with memory. Mrs. Cooper was expecting her fourth child. Old Man Martin was going to build a church first thing when they got to Oregon, said any settlement worth living in needed a place to worship. Sarah studied the faces in the photograph, seeing them now not as victims, but as people with dreams and plans and hopes that had been cut short by other men's greed. "Tell me about them," she said. And there, in the dust and aftermath of violence, Cole Thompson began to speak about the dead, not as weights to be carried, but as lives to be remembered, stories to be told, dreams to be honored even in their absence. The photograph caught the morning light and held it. No longer a curse, but a blessing. No longer proof of failure, but evidence of a love that refused to let good people disappear into the silence of forgotten graves.